Actually, what's awkward about speaking about Raghu after Raghu is that I'm going to agree with him too much, and it's going to be boring. But I'll try and force myself to disagree a little bit. So I think on his view of the global economy, for the most part, I think he's right. I think that what happened was, I think the global financial crisis, in a sense, brought out a set of, I think, critical fault lines within economies in both Europe and the US, which were already there. This is so, I think the primary diagnosis of where we are is that there were problems. We were somehow chugging along without facing them, and I think the global crisis has made us face those problems head on. And I think where I'm maybe more pessimistic than Raghu is in the recovery. I think both the US and Europe are, in my view, in throes of crises which are not yet resolved at all. I think the US, what happened was, the US is a country which has, I think, a paranoid fear of government action and of taxation. And what happened in the US, so the US, I think, primarily, all these worries about fiscal unsustainability are made-up worries. US is undertaxed by OECD standards and could easily afford to have higher taxes. The problem in the US is political, and it's a theme that I have to keep coming back to. The problem in the US is mostly that the US as a country was conceived of in the middle of a tax revolt. Maybe that's not how you conceive of a country to start with, but as a result, it's a country where taxes, there's a paranoid, I think, hatred of taxes, communism as delivered by, for example, the famous communist Barack Obama and other such, intrusions of socialism. So it's that paranoia in the US is what you see shaping the fiscal debate right now. And it's a paranoia that I think was accentuated by the financial crisis. That let the genie out of the bag, because in some sense it made it clear that the government was suddenly looming large. It was doing stuff. It made everybody's fear of government and taxes and stuff like that come out. And we're in a phase where the amount of, I think, irrational, just random rants that you hear from the Republicans all the time is sort of, I think, by a sort of a historical high. So I don't actually think the US is out of the woods. I think the US will lurch from fiscal crisis to crisis, and that's going to do some damage. I think the economy is recovering. There's lots of good things about the US that make it such a powerhouse, and such a powerhouse that we would like to emulate, but I think there is a crisis. Europe has, in a sense, a very different crisis. What this brought out was basically, the crisis brought out was, it forced a certain amount of borrowing, and that brought out the basic fact of fiscal unsustainability throughout Southern Europe. Basically, there was some bad luck. I think Spain had some bad luck. Italy, I think, mostly got what it deserved. France may get what it deserves. So there's a bunch of stuff there which is just very poor use of resources. Lots of transfers from the middle classes to the middle classes, which go through a government mechanism which manages to lose a substantial part of it. So you take money from A, give him to A, but takes 40 cents out because you wasted it along the way. So Europe has, I think, the question of entitlement reform in Europe is key. It's very political, and certainly right now Europe is not in a place where it thinks that that's the popular view in Europe is not that that's what it needs to do. So it needs to be there's going to be a set of, I think, heart-wrenching choices to be made. I don't see it happening. I think it's going to take 15 years for Europe to get into shape. I do think that there will be, the euro will need to be renegotiated, and hopefully what it will renegotiate to is a debt compact of some kind, but could be that will fall apart, part of both. But I think lots of things going to go. So that says, I think, to reinforce what Raghu said, I think if we look to the West for a source of growth, I think we're going to be waiting for a while. I think there's going to be now that's I think we also should say that that's less of a worry than we made it out to be. Our growth, if you take the years 2008, 2009, 2010, was domestic driven, but that's been true most of the time. We are a very large country with very little actually trade, so we live off domestic demand. So I don't think that we are going to be, I don't think there's a huge amount of, this has consequences for us, but there's lots of demand out there. Africa is growing, Brazil is growing, China is growing. In principle, I don't see this as being as much of an issue as sometimes it's made out to be. Now, having said that, we are kind of, our problem in a sense is interesting, because it's not that we have a unsustainable debt and that we are, but somehow we have flavor, a little bit of a flavor of being Italy. So in a sense, Italy is the worst of, in my view, of all. This is a good day to be bashing Italy in India, but it really has the worst of all worlds, because it's undertaxed and and the government is overextended. And I think on both sides, the government does too many things, does it badly, and it doesn't do the main job of collecting taxes. And we have a little bit of that, so that's sort of the problem of the US plus the problem of Europe, all are sort of focused here. We have, I think, a government that, I think we are undertaxed, massively undertaxed in my view. I think there were 47,000 people who are declaring incomes over 1 crore. That's a number that should make all of you laugh. That number, if you look around in Delhi, who's buying those things? The Ferrari dealership, who's there? It's just the numbers don't add up. And so in some sense, we should be aggressively thinking of how to, close the tax loops, get the people into tax net. And on the other side, so that's one side of it. I think we are completely, the rich here are, and I know that this is not the audience, it's not the poorest people in India who are in here. So, but I say that with full cognizance of that. I just think there is we are really, China has over the last 25 years increased its share of GDP that's taxed from, I think, 13% to 24%. And that's at a time when public sector companies in China are being shut down, so it's the revenues are losing revenue in other places, and then spending has been growing, and it has been financing it mostly by, I think, more effective taxation, and we haven't done it. So that's a first fact. Second fact is that with that, we also are subject to all the other things that make Italy unsustainable in a sense. I'm going to stop bashing Italy now, which is that we are a country that has got into this populist, the populist temptation has grabbed us. And it's something that's, it's very easy to legitimize, because we have so much poverty, so much completely unwarranted poverty, so much indefensible poverty. So it's very, very easy to make the case that we need to do something. But then I think the issue that was just raised on, is the government going to open its purse strings? The real problem is not that it's going to open its purse strings, but it's going to open its purse strings without fixing any of the previous attempts to open its purse strings. So it's not that we do too much for our poor. I think that idea that we're creating lots of entitlements which we shouldn't be doing. We do very little for the poor. As I said, we're an undertaxed economy with actually fairly limited redistribution. We've been expanding it, but I don't think we do a huge amount of our redistribution from the middle classes to the middle classes. You think of the CNG subsidy and the diesel subsidy and the water subsidy and every other subsidy that we provide to the middle classes. So it's not that the rural middle classes, the urban middle classes, the fertilizer subsidy, every one of these subsidies are the biggest beneficiary of these are not the poorest people. So I think if you think about where we are, I think it's not entitlements for the poor that we need to reform. It's entitled for the middle classes. We need to start by reforming. Now, having said that, I think we are in a mode where we think that now we've discovered that we can find ways to buy votes by giving away stuff. And this election year, it's going to happen. And I think that the real danger of that is that it doesn't force us to confront the administrative needs of each program. So I think if I think of where we're really taxing the government, I think much more than even in money, is we're taxing its competence. Every new program creates a set of things for the government to do. Our civil services are very, very small relative to our size. We don't have, our government in general, I think, is too small. I think it's the capacity to implement these programs are not there. And we know that. So every new entitlement is created. Why? Because the previous one only delivered 20% of its value. So we never try to fix a program. We never take the view that, if this one isn't working, our job is to make it work first before we go to the next one. It's always, let's put another one there. And in particular, right now the fashion is, let's call it a right, and therefore we're going to think of the courts as enforcing them. So if we are not going to even take the obligation to implement them, we're going to just say this is a right and somehow it has to happen. And now we think that the courts are going to do it for us. But the courts are, then like any other Indian institution, if you've been to a court, you know that, the hopes that the court will make 4 million people who are cheated of their NREGA rights all be able to get those rights. This is just not going to happen. So in some senses we have shifted, we haven't taken the question of how we implement head on at all. And I think that's our central challenge. Our central challenge as a nation is not, I don't think we should worry too much about we're giving away too much money right now. I think we should be worried about the fact that we're doing it so badly. And I think that's the challenge of democracy. When I work a lot on politics in rural India, and the thing that you see is people, every time you give away something that doesn't work, that increases anger. People actually think, okay, they promised me this and then they didn't deliver. And somehow the political class needs to internalize that. They need to realize that promising something and not giving it is worse than not promising it. And I think that general thought that in some sense, I'm glad this is a conclave about democracy, because I think that thought that how do we get the political class to confront its own sort of proclivities, how do we get it to talk about stuff about, the difficult choices, how to get things to work, how to deal with the lack of administrative capacity, how to expand the administration in the right way, how to build institutions that work. These are sets of questions which are central, but in some sense it's the ones that we allied most. And so I think that let's keep talking about the global economy. I think those are interesting questions, but I think if we want to look at where we are going to get stuck, we're going to get stuck on our internal mechanisms. And that's where we are basically a large country. We could mostly ignore the world. But I think if we are slowing down, it's more because we haven't created a culture of governance that will serve our growth than because the world economy has, is in long-term decline or not. I think those are important issues, but I think if we have to think about it, I think we should need to go back to our own I think the problems we have created, the problems we have not solved, and the problems we're trying to look away from. So I'll stop there. I can keep going, but I think there will be more interesting things that we'll hear from the audience. Thank you very much.